If you have spent any time in the corners of the internet where lost civilizations live, you have probably already seen the headline: Cuba's underwater pyramid, finally rescanned after 25 years, and the results are worse than feared. Thumbnails with glowing sonar grids. Comment sections full of people swearing this changes everything we know about human history. Here is the problem. It did not happen. Nobody rescanned it. No robot went back down. No new data came up from that seabed. And once you understand why nobody went back, and what that silence has actually cost us, you will realize the truth is stranger and colder than any fake headline could ever be. This is the real story of the site everyone is lying about, and what 25 years of nothing has really done to it. The story begins in the year 2001, in the waters off the western tip of Cuba, where the Guanahacobibe's peninsula tapers into the sea, and the land gives way to some of the clearest, deepest water in the Caribbean. A Canadian company called Advanced Digital Communications had a survey ship working there, dragging side-scan sonar across the seafloor in a joint project with Cuban authorities. Their target was not a lost city. It was shipwrecks, specifically the old Spanish galleons that had gone down loaded with silver on their way back to Europe. That kind of survey work is slow and repetitive, hour after hour of gray static rolling across a screen, showing nothing but mud and rock. Then the sonar returned something different. At a depth of roughly 600 to 750 meters, more than 2,000 feet down, the operators began picking up shapes with hard edges, right angles, and a strange, almost architectural symmetry spread across an area of about 2 square kilometers. Paulina Zalitsky, the marine engineer leading the survey, and her husband Paul Weindweig later described what they saw as resembling an urban layout, structures that looked deliberately arranged rather than randomly scattered. It was enough to make them stop the shipwreck survey entirely and bring in a remotely operated vehicle to look closer. What the ROV cameras found in the following months, spread across expeditions running into 2002 and 2003, were smooth, flat-faced blocks, some reportedly measuring over 2 meters across, arranged in patterns that included what looked like circular platforms, mounds shaped like stepped pyramids, and long, straight features, some interpreted as roads. Weindweig would later speculate that if these structures were built by human hands, and if the site had once been dry land before it sank beneath the waves, the formations could be as old as 6,000 years, based partly on a land-based megalithic site excavated nearby in 1966. If that number were ever confirmed, it would place construction well before the pyramids of Giza and centuries before cities are known to have existed anywhere in the Americas. That is the claim that made headlines around the world. It is also the claim that, from the very beginning, ran straight into a wall of geology that nobody has ever managed to knock down. Here is the wall. For that patch of seabed to have been dry land, or even a shallow lagoon that human beings could build on, and then to sink more than 600 meters below the surface, would require an extraordinary amount of geological subsidence over an extraordinary amount of time. Sea levels have risen and fallen dramatically across the planet's history, driven by ice ages locking up water, and then releasing it in warming periods. But even the most generous readings of that history do not get you 600 meters of change on a timeline that fits inside 6,000 years. To make the numbers work, you are usually looking at tens of thousands of years, a span so far outside the accepted timeline of organized human civilization that, if these were genuinely constructed by people, it would rewrite the story of our species from the ground up. Faced with that gap, the scientific community did what scientific communities generally do. It got skeptical, and it got skeptical fast. In 2002, Cuban geologist and paleontologist Manuel Iturralde Vinent reviewed the multi-beam bathymetry data from the site and concluded that the formations were the product of entirely natural processes, not human construction. His argument was that the deeper sections of the site showed random alignments inconsistent with intentional design, and that the whole area sits near active fault lines where limestone and granite are subjected to intense tectonic pressure. Under those conditions, bedrock can fracture along clean, straight planes and stack into blocky, almost geometric shapes that look startlingly artificial in a sonar image or under a camera light, without a single human hand ever having touched them. Landslide activity, known in geology as mass wasting, can do something similar. dragging broken rock downslope into piles that settle with a deceptive kind of order. This is not a fringe objection. It is the mainstream and largely unresolved scientific position on the site to this day. Nature is fully capable of producing straight lines, sharp corners, and repeating patterns without any intelligence behind them at all. Basalt columns, sedimentary terracing, fractured granite fields around the world all demonstrate that the human eye is extremely good at finding architecture in geology, whether or not architecture is actually there. That does not mean the Cuban formation is definitely natural. It means that natural is the explanation with the least evidence required to accept it, and extraordinary claims about a lost civilization require extraordinary evidence that, 25 years later, still does not exist. And that brings us to the actual point of this video, because the honest answer to the mystery was never going to come from another sonar pass or another dramatic camera angle. It was always going to come from one thing: a physical sample, a fragment of that stone cut or broken free from the seafloor, carried up into a laboratory, and placed under instruments that do not care what anyone wants the answer to be. Mineralogy can tell you whether a block's internal structure matches natural fracture patterns or shows the kind of tool marks and deliberate shaping associated with quarried stone. Chemical and isotopic analysis can potentially date material in ways sonar footage never can. That sample has never been collected. Not in 2003, not in 2005 during the last serious expedition to the site, and not at any point since. This is the piece almost nobody explains when they talk about this place, and it is the whole reason the mystery is still a mystery. So why, with cheaper sonar, better robots, and more capable submersibles available now than at any point in the last quarter century, has nobody gone back to grab that one piece of rock and settle the argument for good? The answer is not a cover-up. It is something far more mundane, and in its own way far more frustrating. It is money, reputation, and geography, three ordinary obstacles that stacked on top of each other into something nobody could climb. Start with the money. Deep water robotic survey work at 600 to 700 meters is not something you do with a rented boat and a weekend. It requires a ship capable of launching and recovering a pressure-rated remotely operated vehicle, a trained crew, fuel, insurance, and enough budget to cover days or weeks of ship time that can each cost a small fortune. The original survey was a commercial venture with backers who had priorities that had nothing to do with archaeology. Once the sensational headlines broke and the site became a media spectacle rather than a quiet research question, continuing to fund it became a harder sell, not an easier one. Spending enormous sums to bring up a rock that might, in the most likely outcome, turn out to be ordinary fractured granite is not an appealing pitch to people who need to justify a budget. Then there is reputation, and this is the part that stings the most if you actually care about getting to the truth. The moment the words Lost City and Atlantis attached themselves to this site in international headlines, it became almost toxic to serious institutions. Researchers with access to the ships, the sonar, and the laboratories that could have settled this question had every incentive to stay far away from it. Attach your name and your institution's credibility to an expedition that the popular press has already branded a hunt for Atlantis. And if the sample turns out to be nothing more than naturally fractured stone, which is what most geologists already expect, you have spent your reputation on a headline instead of a discovery. The math discouraged exactly the kind of careful, credentialed involvement that could have brought clarity. And finally, there is geography and politics. This site sits in Cuban territorial waters, and Cuba's relationship with much of the outside world, particularly with the countries that have the deep-sea research fleets capable of doing this kind of work, has been complicated and often strained for decades. Foreign vessels do not simply sail into another nation's coastal waters with robotic submersibles and start collecting samples from the seabed. Every survey requires permissions negotiated well above the level of the scientists involved, weighed against fishing rights, security concerns, and a general caution about outside interests showing up with cameras and an agenda. None of that paperwork is impossible. It is simply slow. And slow, when combined with a funding problem and a reputational problem, is more than enough to keep a project frozen indefinitely. Individually any one of these obstacles might have been overcome by a sufficiently determined and well-funded team. It is the way they stacked all at once, on a site that had already been turned into a punchline by its own publicity, that quietly ended the possibility of a real answer for a generation. So what actually happened in the years since, while the world assumed this was still an active mystery under investigation? Almost nothing on the ground, but online everything. In the vacuum left by the absence of new data, the story kept growing anyway. Forums, videos, and articles added details the original footage never contained. Precise measurements nobody had actually taken. Glyphs and inscriptions that appear in no verified imagery. Confident age estimates presented as settled fact rather than the speculative guess they always were. The real, unresolved scientific question, whether these blocks were shaped by human hands or by the patient, indifferent hand of tectonic pressure, got buried under a landslide of invention that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with engagement. That is also, directly, where headlines like the one on this very video come from. Someone at some point decided that a story about a robot going back down and finding something worse than feared would perform better than the true story, which is that no one went back at all. And because the true story requires patience, and the fake one delivers an instant hit of wonder, the fake one spread while the real one sat forgotten in a data drive somewhere, exactly where it has been since the last real expedition ended. That, ultimately, is what worse than feared really means here. It does not mean a new scan revealed something disturbing hiding among those blocks. It means that 25 years of silence, expense, and reputational fear did something no monster from the deep ever could. They let the actual question quietly die, while a fabricated answer took its place in the public imagination, and nobody in a position to correct it had any incentive to bother. The site itself has not changed. It sits exactly where the sonar found it in 2001, in cold, crushing darkness, holding whatever answer it holds, indifferent to every argument raging about it on the surface. What has changed is us, and how comfortable we have become accepting a dramatic story in place of a real one, simply because the real one refuses to resolve on our schedule. Could this still turn out to be the remains of a lost, ancient culture, built on land that later sank beneath the sea over tens of thousands of years? It is not impossible. Nobody has proven it wrong, because nobody has done the one thing that would prove anything at all. Could it simply be an unusually striking piece of natural geology, tectonic fracturing, and landslide debris arranged by chance into a shape our pattern-hungry brains insist on reading as a city, exactly as most geologists who have reviewed the data already suspect? That is, honestly, the more likely answer, and the more boring one, and probably the correct one if you had to bet today. But likely is not the same as known, and the only way to close that gap is to go back down, take a single piece of that stone and put it under a lens, something that in 25 years, despite every advance in technology, nobody has been willing to actually pay for. So here is the real ending, the one the fake headlines will never give you. Nobody rescanned Cuba's underwater pyramid. Nobody brought back results, worse or otherwise. The mystery is still exactly where it was left in 2005, waiting in the dark for someone with the ship, the robot, and the money to finally go finish what a small, curious survey team accidentally started a quarter of a century ago. If you were the one holding that funding, and you knew the truth might turn out to be gloriously disappointing, nothing but ordinary fractured stone dressed up by decades of internet imagination, would you still spend everything to go find out? Or is the mystery, at this point, worth more to us unresolved than it would ever be worth solved?